Welcome back, everyone. This is the podcast Byzantium and Friends, and I'm Anthony, your host. In the year 390, the military garrison of the city of Thessaloniki, Salonika, in northern Greece, massacred a good part of the population in retaliation for the population having lynched its commander. He's a Gothic general. There's a good chance that the army itself was one of these new Gothic units that the empire had formed a very uneasy relationship with in those years. Now, this put the emperor, Theodosius, in a very difficult position. We have a number of stories which say that he was in Milan at the time, in northern Italy. He went to church, and the bishop, Ambrose, refused to let him in. And there was a dramatic confrontation, and the emperor eventually accepted the moral authority of the bishop and displayed penitence, repentance, and undertook some kind of penance before he could be readmitted into the church. The narrative of this moral drama was understood to be that the emperor had shown extreme anger and had retaliated against the people of Thessaloniki, and had then, through some moral persuasion, accepted his responsibility, shown contrition, and was readmitted back into the normal moral order of Christian society. Now, of course, it is entirely possible that this whole drama was basically manufactured. It was a piece of stage work by the emperor and his public relations team, that in fact the emperor had never displayed any anger toward the people of Thessaloniki and had never ordered the soldiers to massacre the people. Instead, his army had acted on their own, which meant he had little control over them. And this was worse. In effect, as some historians argued, I remember Neil McGlynn's biography of Ambrose from way back, that the emperor managed to convert a failure of military control, that is, the fact that he didn't control these Gothic troops with whom he had made this uneasy alliance, into a narrative of his own personal anger and redemption, which was a controllable narrative. So when faced with events outside their control, emperors would sometimes try to convert them into events that were under their control, even if it meant assuming moral responsibility for crimes that they had not committed. Now, another kind of such event were earthquakes. Emperors were generally responsible for the well-being of their subjects. They were also responsible for maintaining good relations with the gods, or God, which, on some level, was supposed to ensure that people were free of natural disasters of all kinds. So earthquakes posed a particular problem for any emperor. It was, in a sense, a failure of control. And how were Christian emperors specifically supposed to respond to such events? My guest today is Mark Roosien, who is a lecturer in liturgical studies at the Yale Divinity School. And he has written a book on earthquakes and liturgy, that is, the response to earthquakes by the church, also by the emperors. That is, how are earthquakes, in these periods from the 4th to the 8th century, how are they perceived by Christian society, and what kinds of responses were appropriate for them? One interesting distinction that he makes is between the civility expected of Roman emperors and the humility that Christian emperors came to display in the face of such events. Now, civility, or civilitas, is a Roman virtue, whereby someone who's in a higher position of power or status, like an emperor, will nevertheless perform equality before certain kinds of peers, let's say senators, and not adopt a sort of haughty and arrogant attitude, but rather treat them as his equals and himself as one among many equals. And this was understood, for example, regarding emperors such as Trajan, to be the virtue of a good emperor who treats senators and others as his peers. So lowers himself from his actual position of power and kind of pretends to be an equal with others. So superficially and from a distance, Christian humility might seem to be the same thing, but it's actually activated in different contexts, and it has a different range of significations. So humility is a form of self-abjection, the emperor will lower himself in the eyes of his subjects, imply that he is responsible for some kinds of sins, which may be vague and not specifically defined, and will seek to regain divine favor by acting in a humble way or through acts of penance, repentance, and so on. And this is what a number of emperors did in response to earthquakes, sometimes at the very moment of the earthquake or immediately afterwards, thereby turning the earthquake into sometimes failures of the collective moral standing of the community in the eyes of God. And the church developed some specific liturgies that responded to the challenge posed by earthquakes, which are difficult events to understand within the kind of moral universe that God is supposed to be operating. Something has gone wrong. It's not entirely clear what. And so a number of responses were developed, cultivated over time. They became traditions to help people cope with the randomness of earthquakes. Now, the book that Mark has written is called Ritual and Earthquakes in Constantinople, Liturgy, Ecology, and Empire, published by Cambridge. And it is a fascinating way of using liturgy to discuss history and or vice versa, which is not very commonly done. Liturgical studies tends to be a fairly esoteric and kind of siloed discipline. And so it was such a fun read to see that field engage with history in a way that allowed me to access this argument in this field. I tend to find most liturgical scholarship to be, as I said, somewhat esoteric, difficult to access. It's a short book, but it does a lot. After all, Hagia Sophia was itself damaged by earthquakes, so that required additional layers of explanation later on in the 6th century. A whole tradition of commemorating what Mark calls Earthquake Day developed and continues in parts of the Orthodox Church. In addition to which, there are the immediate historical circumstances of the earthquakes themselves and the reaction of the population and the whole evacuation procedure for Constantinople. We talk about some of these issues. It's pretty fun. If you're not living through them. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks to medievalist.net for reposting these episodes. Here's my conversation with Mark. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Anthony.
So I was delighted to read your book. I have to say, with a little bit of apprehension, because liturgical studies is one of these areas where few dare to tread.
Yes.
So, right? So in the same way that generally Byzantine studies is, or at least used to be, somewhat insular, just experts talking to each other. So fractally, liturgical studies within it are even more so. And I think it's possibly the only area where I, sit down to talk with a colleague in that, and they start telling me about their work, and I'm lost in 2 minutes. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, and nevertheless, so your book, the term earthquake caught my attention. Yours is probably the most historical liturgical study kind of book that I've ever seen, and so it played right into my interest. Is this something that you were self-conscious about when you were writing it or researching it? What were you trying to do?
Yeah. Liturgical studies, I think, is one of these fields that might be in the top 3 most siloed off from other disciplines. I think maybe because of the kinds of texts that it studies, which is and texts and artifacts, which themselves are very obscure to most people.
Yeah.
Sort of ritual texts and hymns and things like that. So we can think of liturgical texts or even manuscripts as sort of snapshots of how a community practiced its religion at the time that manuscript was copied. But they didn't, these things don't take place in a vacuum. So communities are always sort of in touch with other communities and borrowing from each other. To take one example, maybe you're familiar with this 4th century text, The Travels of Egeria.
Oh, yes, very
This
much
pilgrim,
so.
Spanish pilgrim, nun who goes to Jerusalem and different holy places around the Eastern Mediterranean, and she's just sort of taking notes and she's writing, back to her sisters at the convent, like, look, I saw this, I saw that. And um, some of those practices that she describes end up making their way, outside of Jerusalem to these other places, for example. So what liturgical scholars do is they or have sort of developed over the past 150 years or so is this kind of comparative method of looking at this tradition and these texts and that text, these ritual practices and those, and try to trace their kind of cross-pollination and evolution over time. But as a result of the development of this method, it has become so specific and so I guess like recherche, that it can be hard for outsiders to see, like to open up the box and see what's going on inside because
Mm.
you're sort of trained in this very specific type of comparative work. Um, and that was some of the training that I received at Notre Dame, where I did my PhD in these methods. But there's also a sense among liturgical scholars that they want other people to read their work, and they're always trying to figure out how to make it more accessible. So when I was writing, I definitely had that in mind. Early on in my research, I read a great book by the historian Frances Young, a historian of early Christianity.
Mm.
She wrote this book in the 90s called Biblical Exegesis and the Formation of Christian Culture. And what she was interested in that book was not just like a history of theology or a sort of religious thought, but what she calls Christian culture. She wanted to sort of paint a more holistic picture of how Christianity emerged as a cultural phenomenon, uh, not just a sort of set of beliefs. So she, as part of her framework, she created this kind of diagram, which is kind of famous among scholars of early Christianity, of concentric circles. On the outside are the things that are least related to sort of the core of the culture. And these are the things that ironically scholars spend the most time on, things like theological treatises, uh, acts of different synods and councils, and very high
Mm.
level stuff
Yeah.
um, that intellectual historians and theologians are really interested in. But the people of the time were probably not. They probably didn't even read them, or letters, between bishops.
Yeah.
But as you get closer to the center, you have more, I guess, like immediate kinds of literature. So hagiography, like lives of saints. These are things that people would hear or maybe read if they were literate and they would have an impact on their life. And or homilies, sermons that you'd hear in church. But at the very center of that diagram was liturgy. And I think it
Interesting.
makes some sense, right? Like for a lot of people, like being religious, even today, like to be religious is like I go to church on Sundays,
Mm-hmm.
and that's kind of
Mm-hmm.
how that's maybe the only way I really exercise my faith. So it in some ways has the most immediate
Mm-hmm.
bearing on what it means to be a religious person and to sort of develop a particular culture. So when I got interested in liturgical studies, I was really interested in it because I had that same intuition that liturgy, if we could explore it as a cultural phenomenon, we could kind of get at something of the core of people's lives of faith, and I was really interested in that. So I wanted to look at liturgy not as just a discrete series of texts and their evolution over time, but something that expressed deep commitments of these people that I found really interested in.
Right. By the way, I agree entirely with this. And while I'm just put my cards on the table, not interested in the different parts of the liturgy, and they moved this section from this part to that place over there, and it's like this is momentous, and okay,
Right.
like that stuff, my eyes just glaze over, right? But there's so much that happens in the liturgy as an event that people go to that impacts things that I want to study as a historian, right? Like,
Yeah.
for example, they, read passages from scripture, or, there are, and anyway, there are prayers also for the emperor. There's like, there's so much of the outside world that impinges on it
Yeah.
in one way or another, like what you're asking God for exactly.
Hmm.
That I think is a constitutive element of even people's subjectivity and the way they perceive the world. This is the stuff they hear the most. And this is, in fact, why emperors will sometimes have their edicts read aloud in church. I mean, that's not part of the liturgy, of course, but this is like a point of dissemination for information and ideas and so forth. Like when they refer to the ecumeni, what do they mean?
Oh
Things
yeah.
things like this.
I even, you mentioned like reading imperial edicts in church. Yes, they're not liturgical in the strict sense that liturgical scholars would think. They're not
Right.
liturgical in the sense that these parts, like the Sanctus, right, the Holy, 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 or the Our Father, and where it's placed in the liturgical ritual. But by reading an imperial edict in the context of a liturgical celebration, whether afterwards or somewhere in the middle,
Yeah.
it is kind of caught up into that context in a way that raises its status, even if it's just for the purposes of we want as many ears to hear this as possible. It puts it in a context of people are ready to receive something kind of transcendent.
Hmm.
They're ready to interact with part of their life that's not in the everyday.
Yeah. Yeah. No, those are mutually reinforcing registers. And this is why they're sometimes combined that way. But anyway, let's talk about earthquakes. So, are you from earthquake country? Because I am.
I'm not. I grew up in Michigan, and I never experienced an earthquake growing up. Some tornadoes came through,
Oh,
um,
okay.
but I didn't experience any earthquakes until actually I was writing this dissertation.
Did you, was it a sign? Just,
Um,
yeah. So
yeah,
I've grown up with an awareness that the earth might just start shaking at any time.
yeah.
And often, like in Greece in the summer, it will. It'll just shake a little
Mhm.
bit, but I mean, we've had major ones too. So there was a personal reason why, I mean, your book title kind of caught me as well. I've experienced many, many earthquakes. So it's hard to imagine two things that are sort of as different from each other as the liturgy and earthquakes. One is just kind of rocks colliding with each other underground, and the other is like celebration of worshipers who are trying to elevate their minds to God and so on. Writing this book, were you pulled in these different directions? Like were you that you self-consciously trying to put these two things into conversation that are so utterly different?
Yeah, I did feel pulled in different directions often. As I mentioned, the book was originally a dissertation. And as I was writing, I was trying to learn as much as I could about seismology, about the study of
Mm,
of earthquakes and tectonic plates, and even kind of the phenomenology of earthquakes. Like you said, spending time in Greece is a sort of normal part of your life, but it has an effect on the way you experience the world. That's something that I didn't quite understand personally. So I was trying to read as much as I could about people's accounts of earthquakes, how they would experience them, especially major earthquakes. What was that like? And then going back and finding records from the ancient or late antique writers describing earthquakes, and you find in these chroniclers, really visceral and rich descriptions of earthquakes and what happened, how it felt, and what they saw. Um, so at the same time as I'm trying to do this work in liturgy, I just became really fascinated with with earthquakes themselves as phenomena, as scientific as sort of object of scientific research. And um, I remember about midway through writing, I had to turn in a draft of my dissertation to my readers, and they came back with comments and they said, we don't know what this is about anymore. Is this about earthquakes or is it about liturgy? Because there was so
mm.
many just fascinating things I wanted to include, just things that I became excited about. And then I did have to sort of tone it down at some point to focus the topic on liturgy. But um, what's interesting about earthquakes is that unlike other kinds of disasters like floods or droughts, they happen really quickly. They happen immediately. And even to this day, we really can't predict when they're going to happen. You can only really say that, that there's a likelihood that an earthquake will happen in 5 to 10 years or 50 years in
Yeah,
any
yeah,
spot.
yeah.
So there's a way that especially major earthquakes can strike somehow at the core of a person's experience of the world. And they can provoke a kind of almost unconscious or unreflective response in an individual or in a group. And most of the time that response is, I got to get out of here, or I have to go somewhere, or and I have to act a certain way to make sense of this experience that's really throwing me off.
Yeah.
Um, I saw this as an opportunity to look into that same kind of core of culture that I thought liturgy could also express. Um, as I was reading as much as I could about sort of cultural histories of late antiquity, to try to figure out how to bring the world of liturgy into a broader conversation, I started reading an environmental history and seeing some of the ways in which the landscapes and the natural phenomena of people in the Eastern Mediterranean affected how they viewed the world. And there's a little bit of writing about earthquakes as from this kind of perspective. So even though liturgy and earthquakes are such like on the opposite ends of the spectrum of sort of human culture in a sense, I sort of saw them as meeting in the middle somewhere, as both being windows into like the core assumptions, values of a
Yeah.
culture,
Yeah.
and tried to put them in dialogue.
Yeah, yeah, and it works. Let me tell you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how people experience these earthquakes, especially like the major ones in Constantinople, 396 or
Yeah.
447. So, what kind of damage did they cause? What did people do in the moment, including emperors? And you also mentioned the evacuation plan.
Yeah, yeah,
Tell us about those.
sure. Um, So Constantinople, Istanbul, it's located right on a fault line. It's called the North Anatolian Fault. So there's just a lot of what scholars call seismicity in that
Mm,
region. So on the one hand, they were a normal part of life. They were something that people experienced fairly regularly in that part of the world, but not always to great destructive effect. Um, so when major earthquakes did happen, there was a plan to try well, it wasn't always followed, let's just say. Constantinople at the time was a city that was quite tightly packed together. The the buildings, monuments, and the housing, um, it you wouldn't want to stay in the city walls, at least in the most densely populated parts of the
yeah.
city when an earthquake was happening, because you'd be at risk of having something fall on your head. So, and this did happen actually. We have tons of records from ancient historians telling sad stories about when earthquakes happen. One of the reactions people had was to go into a church to pray, to
Right.
sort of, again, almost like an unreflective religious response to ask God or the divine to put an end to this thing. And unfortunately, that was not the right choice because you'd have the roofs caving in on people's
Yeah, yeah.
heads. So in Constantinople, it seems like they developed a different kind of plan to evacuate the city to avoid this danger. Um, so you can kind of imagine people pouring out of the side roads and all on along to the main drag, which is called the Mese, and then leaving out through the city gates and it seems like they would often congregate at this large field at a place called the Habdoman, which refers to its location 7 miles outside the city. And at the Habdoman is this field called the Campus Tribunalis. It's kind of a major gathering place for large crowds. So in better times, you'd have uh, people gather at the campus to welcome a victorious general back from battle or an emperor back from battle, and they would have this great celebration. You might even have a coronation. The first part of a coronation rite could take place at this field to have as many people as possible experience that. But in earthquakes, it was just the safest place to go for a large mass of people to gather and wait for the earthquake to stop.
Yeah, and pretty far.
And pretty far away. I know, I'm always surprised at just how far it was from the center of town. 7 miles is a long way to walk.
Yes. Yeah, it was around where the old airport was. Um, so, is there any striking accounts of behavior by emperors?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, tell us about some of those.
Yeah, sure. So the first record we have of an emperor participating in one of these kinds of things is Arcadius from probably the year 396. One of the things I encountered, by the way, as I was doing research, is that to find the exact date of an earthquake can be difficult, and there's
Mm.
often debates about, but it's usually within a couple years. Anyhow, so probably around the year 396, the Emperor Arcadius, who was quite young at the time, um, participated in one of these evacuations. And once everybody kind of gathered at the campus, at the Hebdomon, everyone's praying and sort of crying out to God to stop the earthquake because the city is at risk of destruction. And according to the accounts, Arcadius himself joined into this kind of almost like impromptu ritual response. Um, and the nice thing about earthquakes, as opposed to other disasters, is that they do come to an end at some point. There are aftershocks too, as you know, like,
Sure.
and sometimes the aftershocks can be even worse than the first hit, but they do come to an end. And according to the accounts, Arcadius was praying, and at some point he sort of fell on his knees in this very dramatic gesture of humility. And pretty soon thereafter, the earthquake came to an end. People went back to their homes in the city, and there was minimal damage. There was um, a bishop in Constantinople at the time named Severian of Gabala, who was a big supporter of the emperor. And he wrote this sermon praising the emperor for this amazing deed and how, in doing these acts of prayer and repentance to God, he became like a new David, who repented at his sins, but was also a great king. And so it's one of the moments where you see some of this Old Testament imagery coming in for East Roman rulers really for the first time, especially in acts of humility. So that's one example. There's another quake in about 50 years later, in the year 447, where Theodosius II um, takes part in this ritual. And in this case, he actually kind of seems to take the lead. He wants to sort of be at the head of this procession. And as he goes, he takes off his shoes and some of his like royal garb and walks barefoot through the streets and then out to the field in this quite dramatic gesture of imperial humility. And this made a huge impression on people. It was remembered over and over after that. And again, he goes out there, he prays, the earthquake stops at some point, and he gets
Hmm.
some credit for that.
Yes. So that event is very important for historians because, just to give a bit of the context, the Attila and his Huns had just
Yep.
invaded and were expected to be reaching the city possibly very soon. And the earthquake happens at exactly the worst possible moment. They have to sort of scramble to fix the walls afterwards. But I remember also that this was in January,
Hmm.
and he's taking his footwear off to walk in this kind of, and you describe it in the book beautifully as a reverse triumph because, as you mentioned earlier, so this is where parades to the city would set out
Right.
in to celebrate imperial victories, and he's going in the opposite direction on foot, and it's like in this gesture of humility, which is almost like it's brilliant choreography in a certain sense, but I can't imagine that they had it prepared. But just kind of as an impromptu response. Um, I don't know how you would do that in January for whatever. Um,
It's a great
so
question. Yeah, the date was January 26th. We know the precise dates on the calendar because we could talk about this in a minute maybe, but because they become commemorated
yeah.
annually on the church calendar. But January it's not that comfortable in Constantinople. It's not like
No.
northern climate, but it's definitely not time you want to take off your shoes.
No. And some later emperors reenacted this march. I remember Marcian, the
Hmm.
next emperor, he did it. Also barefoot, the sources say, what that means
Hmm.
exactly. Um, anyway, so tell us a little bit about what religious figures at this time are saying about earthquakes. Yeah, you discuss a range of interpretations that they have. So maybe just pick a couple just to give us a sense of what the kinds of
Yeah.
interpret explanations that are circulating here.
Yeah, there's so many different descriptions and kind of accounts of what they mean by religious figures. I mean, one thing to say is, um, particularly in the sixth and seventh century, um, many scholars tend to see that as kind of an apocalyptic age, that there are some, maybe the conquer of Jerusalem by the Persians and then the rise of Islam. People see this as a time where people are thinking a lot about the end of the world, sort of the end of time. And, in the Gospels, Jesus talks about the end of time and what that might look like and mentions earthquakes and wars and things like this. So people sometimes would look at those words of Jesus or other kind of apocalyptic passages in the Bible that mention earthquakes as being portents of the end of time, of the sort of the apocalypse. That's one thing. Some people saw them simply as God's punishment for sin. We or somebody did something wrong, and this is sort of a direct consequence of that. You can see there's lots of examples of this in his novellas, his New Laws.
Mm.
Justinian mentions that uh, earthquakes and other misfortunes are definitely because of homosexuals.
Yep,
Um,
famous quotation.
that famous,
That's
yeah, which uh, unfortunately you still see that today in some people.
yep.
Some Orthodox bishops said, "Oh, earthquakes are caused by heretics." You
Hmm.
know, um, you actually have interesting examples of this. You mentioned the earthquake of 740 in a minute, but that happened during the time of iconoclasm, and the emperor at the time was friendly towards the iconoclasts, and the Orthodox bishops saw him as bringing on this earthquake. Another example is during Justinian's time, when there were a few major earthquakes, and a Coptic bishop looked at this and said, "This is Justinian's fault because he sort of strayed from uh, the doctrinal path that he should have been on. So he was a heretic." So there's a lot of blaming of the other going on when these things happen, depending on what camp you're in. Um, I think the ritual, the liturgy that the church kind of developed to respond to these earthquakes took another interesting tack on the meaning of earthquakes from a religious point of view. It sort of suggested that the earthquakes are not um, any one particular person or group's fault. It's sort of all of our fault. There's something within humanity itself that's internally cracked and broken, and our relations with each other are cracked and broken. John Chrysostom, the famous preacher in Constantinople in the late fourth, early fifth century, talks a lot about this. That somehow the cracks and fissures in the earth reflect cracks and fissures in the human heart and the human community, and so the response should be repentance. Um, and you can see that as people are going through the streets in these processions and responses to earthquakes, they're sort of saying, "Lord, have mercy," repenting. Um, so earthquakes have this almost cosmic significance for humanity as a whole, as being a people that are broken, and so the world, the fallen world reflects the fallen human heart, or something like
Yeah.
this.
Yeah, I wanted to point out that the attribution of earthquakes and other disasters to sin may sound sort of very generic, and in many cases it is generic in the sources, but in practice, especially when you have a major disaster, um, a lot rides on which sin,
Right.
right? Who's committing it,
Yeah.
right? There's a huge difference between a religious community that is willing to accept collective sin, all of us,
Right.
and versus it's those guys. It's those guys over there. That elicits very different kinds of reactions. I was very interested to see where it would go in reading your book, like what exactly would, you know, how the liturgy would shake out there. So tell us a little bit about how earthquakes become a matter of like long-term commemoration in liturgy. Like what do liturgies commemorate for the most part, and how do earthquakes make it
Right.
into that repertoire?
Honestly, that was so interesting to me about this project. Once I learned that the Byzantine Orthodox Church commemorated earthquakes on its annual liturgical calendar, calendar of saints, I thought this can't be. Because what it means is that you got people, in Chicago, Orthodox Christians who on their calendar are commemorating, remembering earthquakes that happened on the other side of the world over 1,000 years ago. And it's sort of
It
like,
is awesome. It's
it's
awesome.
it is awesome. I mean, that's honestly that's how I got into the project. Um, but normally, on the church calendar, let's say in the Byzantine Rite, the most important things that are commemorated are events in the life of Christ. The birth, the Christmas, the crucifixion, Easter, and th through late antiquity, these feasts developed. You get more lesser known feasts like the circumcision of Christ or the Ascension, the
Mm,
Transfiguration, and then you've got feasts of the Virgin Mary, her birth, her death,
mhm.
these different things. But the events of Christ's life or the life of the Virgin Mary, it's easy to see how they could have a kind of universal significance. Christ's death is seen as redemptive for all humanity, so everyone in the world is sort of impacted by that, and so it's something to remember and to sort of make real every year at certain times, or even every Sunday. Um, and then eventually the calendar gets populated with saints, saints from different regions who somehow in their lives embodied these values, embodied this kind of life, this divine life. But it's very rare that you see local events commemorated on liturgical calendars and raised to that level,
Mhm.
almost by including a local, almost seemingly random event like an earthquake to the level of a transcendent sacred history. Um, it seems very confusing. So, what did they see in these things that
Mhm.
would
Mhm.
warrant raising them to that level? That was really what I wanted to find out in the project. Um, let me see if I can explain it. I think I'm still thinking it through, to be honest, because I think it is still so strange. I mean, we think of earthquakes and other disasters today as being almost devoid of any transcendent meaning. Like it's just plates.
Right, it's random.
It's
Yeah,
random
it's random
stuff.
stuff. Yeah, yeah.
Can't control it. Um, even among other kinds of disasters, you can almost see disasters now, flooding and storms and stuff. We can see how climate change contributes to the right to like more intense manifestations of these things, but earthquakes not as much, or at least not obviously as much. So they seem so random. They seem almost devoid of meaning. When you hear stories or experience this yourself of people that you know who die in earthquakes, it just seems like an inexplicable tragedy. Like there's no rhyme or reason for this. But I think we have to understand that for ancient peoples, they saw it as the complete opposite. Earthquakes were not devoid of meaning, and it was really that they had a surplus of meaning. There was so much meaning to be found in earthquakes, um, that we want to do something in a way to kind of corral it into one thing, one narrative that we can use to make sense of it. And I think that's what the earthquake commemorations did when the church celebrated them year after year, was to take an event that was often tragic in the life of the community. Maybe it some of these earthquakes killed many people,
Hmm.
and to find some kind of redemption in them. Um, and you can see how they constructed that narrative through the shape of the rite itself, through the shape of the ritual as it sort of proceeds. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how this is where the liturgical studies
Hmm.
training came
Yes,
in.
yes.
How did this part get here and that part get there? Um, but the narrative that it traces is really quite interesting. It begins in the evening service, and you have these readings from the Old Testament, especially from the Hebrew prophets, who talk about how the earth is sort of angry or is lashing out at people because of different sins. Think of like these prophets who talk about when you shed blood, the blood goes into the ground, and the ground sort of cries out at the injustice
Oh,
of it all.
that's heavy.
It's heavy. So it's framed as this kind of um, the Earth's natural reaction to our sins, and God is kind of using the Earth in this an interesting way. And the Earth has its own agency, um, and in response to that kind of outcry of the Earth through the earthquake, the people go on these processions. They retrace the steps of their evacuation route, and now the evacuation route is kind of a processional route
Hmm.
where they use these hymns of repentance um, kind of rooted in Lord have mercy until they get to the end of the procession, which is gathering once again at that great field in the Hebdomon, where they gathered at the time of the earthquake to pray until it stopped. Once they get there, you sort of have the end of the ritual. And at the end of the ritual, you have readings from the New Testament about how God chastises those people that He loves, And so this is a kind of sign for us um, to shape up a little bit, but also realize that earthquakes are not just random events. In some ways, they're we can learn God is teaching us somehow through this. And
Yeah.
then the gospel reading is Jesus calming the storm on the Sea of Galilee. So you see this kind of redemption at the end.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's very unique among liturgical rites in that it has a narrative arc to it. It
Yeah.
begins sort of in sin and death, and then it ends up in redemption. So I think this could be a way, when it was first created in the mid 5th century, a way of helping people to process some of the trauma of earthquakes, and kind of put some language to it that would allow them to understand it and then also be prepared for the next time it would happen.
Yeah, and certainly emperors had an interest in getting these kinds of messages across because,
For
in a certain
sure.
sense, they're the ones who are entrusted with preserving, the balance and keeping everyone safe. But they can't do anything about earthquakes. So I think they would have. So, like in the overall moral economy of the liturgical cycle, the other events that you mentioned, of course, commemorating the events in the life of Christ and the Virgin Mary and even the saints, they don't have the
Hmm.
same kind of narrative arc.
Right.
They're not the sort of thing where some, collective sin causes this kind of problem. And nevertheless, this is something that people have to deal with, especially in Constantinople. And you need to be able to make sense of it. But it's like otherwise a hole, it's a gap in the yeah. Anyway, so speaking about, so I'm going to jump to a somewhat related topic, but
Hmm.
it's a bit different. And this is about Hagia Sophia. And famously, a few years after, a couple decades after Justinian built the first version of it, there was an earthquake, which I think like a year later led to the collapse of the dome.
Hmm.
And this was a major event of the later part of his reign, and it had to be rebuilt. Now, in the book, you have a wonderful account of the symbolism of Hagia Sophia, just kind of as a building. And this
Yeah.
is something that we can talk about like forever. And I would
Yeah.
love to do that, by the way. It's a building that really, what's the word? It really captures it invites me to try to explain all of the different elements in it and why are they here?
Hmm.
What are they doing, right? And I think it is much more unified as a kind of what it's trying to present. It has this cosmic kind of message. Anyway, so we don't need to get into all of the details of that, but maybe you could say something about what challenge the earthquake and sort of cracking of the dome posed um, to this sort of cosmic symbolism of the church, and how did people try to make sense of it?
Yeah. So when the Hagia Sophia was built, in 537, um, it was quite intentionally built as you said, as a building that evoked cosmic symbolism. It was almost a microcosmos unto itself,
Yeah.
um, a world in miniature. And there's been as you know, there's like been a ton of work on this by art historians as well, looking at some of the features of the church interior. Um, the floors, the marble floors, the marble tiles have an almost oceanic quality to them, and it sort of
Hmm.
reinforces this idea of the Hagia Sophia as like a world. Um, and the dome, of course, is like evoking this ancient cosmology of the heavens as a dome. So it's so wonderful. So people attach this kind of conceptual association with the church as a cosmos, and when it cracks through an earthquake, it threatens that symbolism of the stability of a cosmos. The cracking of the dome of the church, and eventually it caved in partially,
Hmm.
was in some ways a symbol of what people were experiencing when they experienced earthquakes. There's a great line. that I found in Seneca. I mean, Seneca's of course sort of from a different era, but he describes pretty well the experience of earthquakes when he says like earthquakes show us that the whole world is sort of subject to change, alteration, and destruction. That there's no stability in life. When you stand on your own 2 feet and then it starts to shake out from under you,
Mm.
where do you
Right.
go? So there's a kind of phenomenological experience of instability that becomes reflected in the cracking of this world in miniature that we've created. So it could be seen symbolically as a real tragedy, not just the breaking of a nice looking building, but somehow the fracture of a worldview that we have. How could this perfect building, which is so balanced, so at the time it was just inconceivable you could build a building like this. It was so
Yes.
perfect, and then it's broken. Um, so a lot of people saw a lot of significance in this. I try to suggest in the book, and I don't know, we can argue about it, but it does seem that some writers of the time picked up on this and thought that Justinian himself was the problem, and that maybe he invited the earthquake, and this is God's judgment on him. But in any case, because things were not really going so well there at the end of
Yeah,
his
yeah.
reign,
Rough
a lot
time.
of bad, rough times. Um, so he gets to work pretty soon after that happens to rebuild it, and successfully rebuilds it within 5 years. It's cracked in 557. It's rebuilt in 562. And actually, just an interesting note, one of the wonderful things about Hagia Sophia is the windows on top of the dome, and at different times of day, you have these shafts of light sort of pouring in through
Hmm.
these windows. Well, apparently the windows were added at the reconstruction of the dome
Oh.
after the earthquake. They didn't exist there before, and they were put there as a kind of way to mitigate when the earth shook to make sure that this didn't happen again. It created a little bit of flexibility. So I like to, and there's all this amazing symbolism of light
Oh,
in the
yes.
Hagia Sophia.
Oh, yes.
And I like to think that, it was earthquakes that precipitated this symbolism. We think of it as part of the cosmic design, but in some ways it was a matter of necessity
Yes.
architecturally to make sure that it could withstand these things. Anyhow,
It makes
so
the dome lighter too.
yeah, so in once they finished rebuilding the dome, they held a rededication ceremony for the church. It was a multi-day event. It was, Justinian had sort of been out of the public eye for a long time. This is his re-entry back into sort of mainstream Byzantine life. And it was just this wonderful, sumptuous festival, complete with obviously lots of liturgies to rededicate the church and special hymns that were written for the time, but also banquets. And one of the aspects of the rededication ceremony was that he commissioned a poem to be written about the Hagia Sophia by a well-known orator and poet of the time named Paul the Silentiary. And this poem survives to this day. It's quite a famous poem mostly because of the poet's Paul's description of the interior of the church and the different stones
Hmm.
and marbles, and it's a really it's an ekphrasis, it's a sort of beautiful evocation of how the church looked at the time and how people might have thought of it. But uh, there's another aspect to Paul's poem that addresses sort of the cultural and even political significance of the Hagia Sophia, its destruction and rebuilding, that I kind of focused on in the book. Um, Paul is reticent to talk much about its destruction. He wants to emphasize how great its rebuilding is. He says at some point in the poem, "Let us wipe away the 5 year tears from our eyes. It's been destroyed for 5 years, but now it's back. And now it's better than ever." And he says, Justinian is a new Bezalel, the Old Testament figure who designed the tabernacle, or he's a new
Hmm.
Solomon who designed the temple. That Solomon symbolism becomes really important later too. Um, and he says, when God created the world, he did a pretty good job with this cosmos, but Justinian has made a newer and even better cosmos that will truly last forever. And so he's almost overcompensating
Yeah.
for the destruction of the previous iteration, or partial destruction of the previous iteration of this new and better cosmos. And he says that with a lot of confidence, this new building is definitely going to hold up. So he doesn't talk very much explicitly about what happened in the earthquake. He alludes to it, but you can see he very much wants to move past it and get to the
Yeah.
this is a manifestation of the victory of Justinian and his empire, especially at a moment when that sense of his victoriousness was very much in doubt.
Yeah. He was 80 at the time. Yeah. So in the book, you also discuss later earthquakes, and you trace some of the extensions of these stories into the middle period. We don't have time to get into all of that today, but
Mhm.
you had this wonderful expression that stuck out at me, which was Earthquake Day.
Yeah.
And it's kind of one. This is so the it's an institution for the annual commemoration of these earthquakes, or a set of them. It's not clear if they're thinking that they're referring to one, but kind of merging a number
Yeah.
of them together, or whatever. It doesn't matter. But you put it in quotation marks. You discuss it as a kind of holiday of sorts. It's kind of like, I don't know, Veterans Day or something like that. So tell us about, did you coin this? And tell us a little bit about the just the place that it had in the festival cycle of the church.
Yeah, I did coin it. It's kind of corny.
Thank you. Oh, I'm going to be
But
using that.
okay, good. It was
Yeah.
yesterday, actually, October 26th. So I was wishing everybody a happy Earthquake Day.
Ah, yes.
Um, so that date, October 26th, it has its roots in another earthquake, one of the later ones that was commemorated from the year 740. That's what I mentioned earlier about happened
Yeah.
during the time of iconoclasm, um, or just before that. And it was a pretty major earthquake. It was very destructive. It was well remembered over time for its destruction and also for the momentous sort of period in history that it happened. Now, by this time, the church already had like half a dozen earthquakes that it was commemorating every year, and many of them prescribed these long processions out to the field, 7 miles, sometimes in the dead of winter. I kind of think that people were sick of doing this all the time, and maybe wanted to consolidate some of these commemorations into one.
And put it in October.
Just put it in October. Yeah, put it on one date. The most recent one that was very momentous and really worth remembering. Because after a couple of generations, you just don't really remember what happened during an earthquake, and so
Yeah.
the symbolism gets or the memory of it gets lost. So anyhow, for this date, 740, it kind of became a catch-all for earthquake stuff. Um, you had in the coming decades after 740 hymnographers composing new works about earthquakes that would be sung during the commemoration. And after that, you start to see that some of the other commemorations fall away. They start to get forgotten because all the energy of earthquake reflection happens on this date. So it kind of, you're
Mm.
right, it's rooted in one particular earthquake, but it also becomes just a day to think about earthquakes in general as matters of like religious concern. The
Yeah.
other aspect of that day that I think made it what it was is that it was also the feast of Saint Demetrius of Thessaloniki. Saint Demetrius is a very important, famous Byzantine saint who was known for his ability to protect and heal people and even protect cities. Like he's sort of thought of as the protector of Thessaloniki. Um, the fact that the earthquake happened on his feast day meant that during that day, it seems like people were not just calling out to God for protection, but to Saint Demetrius as well. So he kind of gets tied, even though he, lived 400 or 500 years before this, he gets tied up in the drama of the earthquakes,
Mm.
and he now becomes a protector of us in our experience of natural disasters. So the earthquake day and Saint Demetrius day sort of become fused. Uh, Even to this day, I saw on Instagram just yesterday there was a church in
Yeah.
San Francisco, an Orthodox church in San Francisco, where there's a lot of earthquakes, and they said, tomorrow is the feast of Saint Demetrius and the earthquake, and the way that the post talked about it was like very much intertwining their legacies. And here in San Francisco, we experience earthquakes too, so we should call out to Saint Demetrius for his
Yeah.
prayers. So as a kind of a serendipitous like coincidence that the earthquake happened on his feast day and
Yeah.
that prolonged over time.
By the way, it occurred to me that they don't do the same with like plague, right? There's no
Mhm.
liturgy for the plague or commemoration or anything on a plague day.
Yeah.
This is wondered why.
I think maybe
Mm.
because earthquakes, among other disasters, have such an immediate quality. You know exactly when they begin and more or less when they end.
Mm.
Plagues stretch out over decades and
Yes.
sometimes
Yeah.
centuries.
Centuries. Yeah.
Droughts can be for whole seasons or
Yeah.
years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even fires, they can last for a long time. So I think among natural disasters, earthquakes are easiest to pin down to a particular instance, a particular
Mm.
event, rather than something that just drags
Yeah,
on.
it is a more discrete event. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You
We do
react to it
have
in the moment. It takes hours.
we
Yeah, yeah.
we do have some liturgical evidence for commemorating like major astronomical signs, eclipses,
Yeah.
things like that, that also sort of are portents of something, so whatever
Mhm.
something important might have been happening at the time, and maybe this was seen as showing the importance of it. So,
Yeah.
but
Well, those
earthquakes,
those they could explain.
that's right. Yeah,
They could
yeah,
explain if you ask the right people. Um, anyway, Mark, thank you so much. Any final thoughts, or like, what are you working on next, or whatever you want to close with?
yeah. I have a couple thoughts here, although we probably just covered them in the conversation. Well, I'll just say that this is a really fun topic for me to work on. When I was thinking about a dissertation topic, I wanted something that would keep me occupied, for the next several years, and it sure did. It turns out natural disasters are endlessly interesting, and um, as I said at the beginning, kind of get to the core of human experience, especially of like pain and suffering. The real stuff of religion
Yeah.
can happen during natural disasters. So um, I want to thank you for inviting me on the podcast and giving me the opportunity to talk about it.
No, no, I really appreciated the effort to make the world that you study more accessible to like, generic historians. It is kind of inaccessible. So, and earthquakes have all of these social and political and ethical ramifications that, like we didn't even talk about like the distinction between civility and humility in an emperor. This comes
Oh
out
yeah.
very strongly during these events. There's so much going on. I think you picked the right topic. So, well done.
Thank you so much.